This is going to be the start of the series How to Catherine, a guide intended to make you a better Catherine player. I'll be your host, Shas. In this video, we'll be talking about the mindset and philosophy you should have when you're beginning to take Catherine more seriously. In order to continue, however, you should be familiar with some of the basic mechanics in the game. A video by Pen Ninja, found here, does a pretty good job at this. However, it is my goal to get you to the next level.
I'd like to take just a minute to elaborate on some terminology. So in Catherine, there are two kinds of hits, half hits and full hits. Half hits are where you are knocked into a sidle or spidering position after being hit. This can occur after being pillow hit, or if your opponent falls multiple floors on top of you. The next kind of hit is a full hit, which happens after being drop kicked. This type of hit will send you down multiple floors, without letting you spider on the first block. However, you will still catch onto any open positions further down. The last bit of terminology that I think is important to know is X Factor, which is the juice. This drink is an item that spawns that, when used for a brief period of time, will let you climb 2 blocks instead of 1. Obviously, this is a very powerful item. I should also just take a brief second to elaborate on some of the rules in competitive Catherine, and there really aren't that many of them. But the most important is legal stages. There are 9 total multiplayer stages. 3 of them are kind of boring and sometimes broken, so they've been considered banned. The 6 legal stages are Underground Cemetery, Torture Chamber, Quadrangle, Clock Tower, Spiral Corridor, and Cathedral. Of course, if you really want to play on an illegal stage, I'm not going to stop you. I plan on doing an in-depth video about each of these later, but it will suffice just to know that each stage focuses on one kind of gimmick or playstyle, which makes each map play wildly different.
So let's start at the fundamentals. Catherine the game itself is relatively simple. Players push and pull blocks in order to climb the tower. You really only have 2 buttons. The most common question I get is, how do I climb better? And the answer I always end up giving is that you just need to play more. And believe it or not, some people have expressed dissatisfaction at that answer, but I think that line tells you a lot about Catherine. You see, if you wanted to get better at any other fighting game, the answer is a little more clear. You practice combos in the lab. Catherine is different. The main way to get better at solving puzzles is to solve a lot of them, which means playing through the story in challenge modes in order to see as many different puzzles as you can. Oh, and speaking of the single player, you kind of have to do that anyway, since in order to unlock the multiplayer in the first place, you have to beat the game. Unless you manipulate some save data, which you can check the description if you're interested. Regardless, you really should get used to the story anyway, as the sheep on the landings actually teach you useful climbing mechanics. Along with the story mode is the Rapunzel minigame found in the bar. Rapunzel, instead of focusing on your ability to climb under the pressure of time, forces you to solve the puzzles in a limited number of moves. And due to the nature of this, the puzzles are much more depth oriented, so you will be doing lots of spidering. This will help you orient yourself in 3 dimensions. There is also the Babel mode, which boasts the 4 most challenging stages in the game, which are unlocked via getting perfect scores in the regular story stages. This is something that people eager to get into Catherine can overlook. Everybody wants to be a fighter, but nobody wants to climb no hard-ass blocks. The 2 are a lot more dependent than you would think. Climbing is inseparable from getting good at Catherine. If you find yourself standing still trying to figure out a solution, you're doing something wrong. Now Catherine, as opposed to most puzzle games, opts to put both players on the same tower, which allows you to directly interact with your opponent. This is where many people consider Catherine to be a fighting game, in the sense that you can win not only by climbing the tower first, but also by being the last one standing. Obviously then the question becomes, how do I fight better? The short answer is complicated, while the long answer is, it's really complicated. But hopefully after hearing some analogies, you'll begin to be able to make sense of it. You see, Catherine is a lot like chess, shogi, go, etc., in the sense that you have a board where some positions are favorable for you, and thus some blocks are more valuable than others. This is also similar to the idea of spacing most fighting game players are familiar with, except extending that notion to a board. And with that, you should know that the first rule of fighting is that you don't want to force a fight. A win is a win, and so it doesn't matter whether you try to outclimb your opponent or beat them to a pulp. More often than not, you'll probably be fighting indirectly over some important position to get closer to the goal. However, For the times when you do find yourself in sheep-to-sheep combat, here are some things you should be looking for. The high ground. For those of you familiar with chess, the high ground is like having your pieces in the middle of the board. For those of you who are not, let me explain. Full hits are stronger than half hits, thus any position that puts you over top of your opponent is what you should be looking for. It's where your sheep is the strongest. Sometimes this will require you to pull or manipulate blocks throughout the duration of a pillow fight, which you can only get comfortable with after playing many different games. Furthermore, the high ground often gives you many different options, such as continuing your climb or playing defense over a position. It's up to you to make the call with what you feel comfortable with and transitioning between different phases. This is also where your personality and style can really come out, because you have direct control over what you decide to do with the high ground, and how you decide to shape the tower. The next bit of advice comes on the other end of that, as in what to do when you're on the defensive. One of the many nice things about Catherine is that every stage, except for Quadrangle, spawns items, and furthermore, items have an increased spawn rate the more behind you are. This means that farming for X factors or blocks is a totally viable strategy. However, if you find yourself forced into a fight where your opponent has the high ground, you have a few options. The first thing you can try to do is bait them off of it. Sometimes feinting where you're going can make your opponent react improperly. Other times, you may want to go down and around your opponent, as the high ground is really only deadly one floor up. If you go into a spider position or even drop down a level or two and simply go around them, it might be possible for you to ignore them. The last kind of situation is where you have an unavoidable fight. This is where the real time component of Catherine can really come in handy, as sometimes you'll be able to push out on your opponent to knock them down to your level, rather than them being guaranteed a hit. This means that mind games are especially powerful in Catherine. Remember, very little in Catherine is guaranteed. Now for the real trick in Catherine. Sometimes you will need to indirectly attack your opponent, by finding which blocks are anchors to other blocks on the level. Because blocks connect on edges, sometimes the structure of dependencies can become very tricky. However, it is your job as the player to become creative in finding what blocks hold up the tower, and by manipulating some blocks over here, you can change blocks over there. If you're good enough, you'll even be able to push out the entire tower. Something that may be able to help you is to visualize the board as made up of different kinds of staircases. There is usually some kind of upward diagonal movement somewhere in the structure. Finding the linchpin that holds up the whole thing is key in bringing that staircase down. In summary, climbing is fundamental in Catherine, then come the fighting techniques. Also, in terms of victory, never discount a win by climb. Fighting and climbing are two sides of the same coin. Many people assume that the fighting in Catherine is only when both sheeps directly interact. However, in Catherine, much of the fighting can be considered indirect over the entire board. If you really want to get better, make sure that you watch and analyze different games, and make sure you understand what each push and pull does for each player. Feel free to take it as slow as you want. That about sums it up for this video. Stay tuned for the next one, which is going to be more about concrete techniques and mechanics to implement in your gameplay. Feel free to ask me on Twitter any Catherine questions you may have. If you're interested in chatting with the Catherine community, check the description for the Discord information. I hear there's also a Catherine subreddit now. Until next time.